So, my name is Pippa Corrie. I'm a medical oncologist based in Cambridge. And I also chair what's called the NCRI Skin Cancer Clinical Studies Group, and we're responsible for developing new clinical trials. And Imogen's given me the quite ambitious task, in fact, for first thing on the agenda, to talk about NICE guidelines and access to clinical trials. And these are quite big, hefty topics. So I've tried to simplify it as much as I can. There's quite a few slides I'm going to go through. I am around all day if you want to come and ask me any questions, but I really just want to give you an overview of how we function, moving research into the service framework and changing practice. And some of the stuff I'm going to talk about will also be unpacked later in the day. You've got talks on clinical trials. You've got James Larkin talking about targeted immunotherapies. So again, don't worry if a lot of this sounds a lot. It is going to be unpacked over the course of today and tomorrow. So I'm giving you this sort of the heads up. So if I can work out how to move the slides on. Okay, so NICE. A number of you will have heard of NICE. It stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And it's really important because it does provide the framework through which new developments enter clinical practice. NICE is actually an organisation that is based in England. Wales takes directives from NICE, but Scotland has its own system. So just be aware, this is not UK, this is NHS England. And the technology appraisals are probably the things that most people are aware of. They're associated with the drugs that we are now, I'm an oncologist, that we're using routinely in clinical practice. But these also cover other things. So you can get technology appraisals associated with devices, surgery, and other aspects. And then NICE also has a whole bunch of other roles that you may or may not be aware of. And in particular, and the top one in this list, clinical guidelines, is important because these actually review the whole management of a particular disease from the point of early diagnosis, prevention, through to treatment, and patient-related issues, longer-term management, survivorship, and so on. There are a whole bunch of other things: public health, medicines practice, staff, would you believe, staff safety. A lot of these things I'm not going to be touching on, but the two areas I do want to talk about specifically are the melanoma assessment and management guidelines that were written and published in 2015, and then to talk a little bit about the technology appraisals. So up until 2010, we had some guidelines that were really written by a bunch of motivated clinicians in the UK, and they were very much there really for the professionals. They had no teeth, I would say, in terms of commissioning, for example. But NICE had decided that they would take on the management of melanoma specifically. And that's really important because actually NICE, as I said, provides that framework that commissioners will then look at in terms of developing the practice and funding initiatives. So the melanoma guidelines were there specifically to look at uncertainties in our practice and where there is variation in practice. And they set out specifically to look at the role of sentinel lymph node biopsy, so areas of controversy, the whole of treatment from stage 0 to 4, also about issues about follow-up, and again touching on vitamin D, an area that's important to patients that they wanted to look at. So I'm just going to go through just the highlights where I think there have been practice changes associated with those guidelines, just to make you aware of how these things have happened. So vitamin D, as a consequence of those guidelines, there were recommendations that actually vitamin D should be measured in all people who were diagnosed with a melanoma, and that those people with suboptimal levels should be supplemented. And that is quite a significant change, and I think something that was very important and of interest to patients. In terms of sentinel lymph node biopsy, this has been a hugely controversial area as to whether this should be or shouldn't be offered to patients, and whether it's a therapeutic or a staging investigation. Now, these recommendations in the guidelines start with the word consider. And when you see consider, it basically means, well, you can, maybe you don't have to. And that's usually because the evidence base is not terribly great. So they can only give a very firm recommendation if there's a very high quality evidence base. So here you can see two key outcomes, two recommendations, both starting with consider. So consider sentinel lymph node biopsy as a staging procedure. And then if it's positive, consider completion lymph node dissection. So these things basically give permission for those clinicians who are doing this to go ahead and so do, and to make sure that commissioners provide the funding to make it happen, and to give permission for patients also to ask for it. So if you're in a region where it's not offered, you can actually say, actually the guidelines say, you know, that this is an option for me, can you refer me out of region if it's not available locally, because I want it, thank you very much. So again, these are written for clinicians and for patients to be able to use and to impact on their practice and their healthcare. Surveillance has been a big controversial area, particularly with introduction of the new treatments. Melanoma Focus has a consensus document on its website with the professional recommendations here. And again, the NICE guidelines took this on board and said, yes, it is reasonable to offer routine surveillance, imaging for those people thought to be at high risk of recurrence, imaging 6 monthly for 3 years. It doesn't say you must, again, consider, because again, the evidence base is very, very sparse in this area. Then going on to metastatic melanoma, genetic testing had come in. These new treatments weren't available before with the professional guidelines that I mentioned. So this now for the first time talks about the importance of genetic testing. But you will notice if you look at this document that there's no mention of specific drugs other than dacarbazine, and that's because the new drugs, the immunotherapies, the targeted therapies, are all subject to their own individual technology appraisals, and if they're in a technology appraisal they can't go in the guidelines, they work side by side. So that's just a technical issue, but I'm going to talk, and just the other thing about in-transit metastases. There's a whole list of options here, but just to point out, and it's relevant to the back of the room, that now in that list of options for in-transit metastases is included electrochemotherapy. Again, a new intervention that has been developed and brought into practice recently is now an approved option for patients. So those guidelines are then reviewed by a different set of professionals who then actually interpret these into a group of what are called quality standards, and it's those standards that the commissioners will look at and use in order then to commission their new developments, sometimes to remove things out of practice, but in this case most of it is actually adding to the armamentarium of managing melanoma patients, which is great. So just to mention that those guidelines covered cutaneous melanoma. Clearly there are people with rarer melanomas, the uveal melanomas, for example, through the UK professionals and supported by Melanoma Focus, there is now a set of consensus guidelines around the management of uveal melanoma, and I've given you the website here, and I hope you will all be able to access these slides in due course, and they have been endorsed by NICE. Although NICE is never going to get round to looking probably at a rarer cohort of patients, we can go and get endorsement by NICE, and then actually they obviously have the teeth in terms of impacting healthcare. And again, mucosal melanomas, again a smaller cohort of patients, and supported by Melanoma Focus, there's a group currently looking at developing guidelines for those patients as well. So we've talked about clinical guidelines, and I just want to talk for a few minutes about the technology appraisals, which are really about the new drugs that have come into practice. And just to mention really that there are different types of technology appraisals. The single technology appraisals are basically taking a single drug and they are looked at once the new drug is licensed or it's been already licensed and it's being looked at in a different indication. And I've said here it aims to produce guidance soon after technology is introduced in the UK. Previously, it would take 3 years or more from the time of licensing to the actual appraisal document, which was a nightmare because you have people wanting to use the drug and you can't because NICE hasn't looked at it. And that was when the CDF, the Cancer Drug Fund, came in to help carry new agents until the appraisal was done. The whole NICE process has been reviewed, and they're now trying to bring that appraisal meeting to as soon after the licensing as possible. So there's a lot of horizon scanning that's happening to enable that to happen. You can have what's called multiple technology appraisals, and apparently now there's a fast track appraisal, which I'm not sure is that fast track. It's looking at technologies with exceptional value for money. And what I can find on the website is that when a NICE appraisal is positive, there is a 90-day window before the commissioners are duty-bound to actually fund a new treatment. And if through this system, that window is reduced to 30 days. So I'm sure that's great. It doesn't quite sound as fast track as I'd like, but we'll see how it works in practice. So the importance to understand is that when a drug is licensed, it's licensed based on the evidence of efficacy. When NICE looks at treatments, they're looking at cost effectiveness, and this is where it gets very muddy. So it's looking about how effective it is and what's the cost of that amount of benefit that's being offered. Does it represent value for money? And that's a very different issue. It's a health economic argument. It's not as clear-cut as the efficacy argument. So it's a very complex procedure, but it's very thorough, and having been involved with the melanoma drugs, I actually have found it very impressive. It starts with a scoping workshop. There's a new drug that's licensed. What's the benefit of that drug? What is the standard of care? What's going to be the comparators? Which is the patient group that's going to be affected by this new treatment? What are the costs? What are the health economics behind that new treatment? It goes from that scoping time to an appraisal consultation, a full document that is circulated widely, and then a meeting happens with all the relevant people, which generates a document which then generates a proposed recommendation, which then again can be appealed if people are not happy, and then a final appraisal determination of FAD is generated. And at each stage there are all sorts of stakeholders that are involved. So that's patient representation. Melanoma UK, Melanoma Focus often provide representation. Clinical experts like myself and many of the people who you're going to meet in the next day or two. The manufacturer will generate the evidence base and their own health economic argument. And then there's an independent group called the Evidence Review Group who will again do a separate independent health economic argument. And then everybody gets in the room and they all present their case. Everybody has a chance to speak. The patient voice is amazingly powerful. And then the committee makes a decision in a closed room. So it's a very thorough system. And for us, in melanoma, it's been really helpful. So this is a summary of the new agents that we brought through. Ipilimumab, pembrolizumab, nivolumab in terms of immunotherapeutics, and then the targeted agents. We have managed to, working with the committees, get all these drugs through the NICE appraisal process, and that's because of the great work as a team we have done, the experts, the patients, and working with the pharma, with pharma, to actually achieve good results. We've had a great committee, I have to say, who've looked at all of these consistently, so we've got a great relationship with them. So I think it's been a very interesting and fruitful outcome. So again, just to move NICE into clinical practice, as I mentioned, the NICE approval is based upon the license indication. The commissioners, once that NICE recommendation is made, have 90 days, heads up basically to say, in 90 days, these drugs will be available to the patients. We have to prescribe those drugs in a slightly strange way. We have to register every individual patient because these are high-cost drugs on a system called BlueTech. And you just need to be careful that we were caught out at the end of last year where actually the criteria for access online was different to the NICE guidance and it was restricting. And so we are very aware that NHS England is going to take every opportunity to reduce the cost burden of these drugs. So we managed to change a lot of those criteria. So moving on to the second section, which hopefully you will see how it fits. Clinical trials provide the evidence that justifies the change in practice that we've just talked about. So they're really, really important. And only through those clinical trials will those drugs get a license from the licensing authorities. And NICE will only look at licensed drugs. What's in it for patients? Well, one of the great benefits, I think, is that patients can access state-of-the-art treatment as soon as it's out there. And that can be really exciting. There are no certainties that people will benefit from taking part in a clinical trial, but it gives you the very best chance, particularly now when there's such thorough preclinical work. Drugs actually getting to that point of a clinical trial have a much higher chance of being effective than ever before. But what we do know is there's a huge amount of altruism there for patients taking part in clinical trials. Future generations are likely to benefit. So I just wanted to very swiftly show you a couple of examples with vemurafenib, the BRAF targeted agent. It was one of the very first drugs that came into a phase 1, the very first in-man trial, and multiple people benefited immediately. And this slide just shows you a patient with multiple melanoma metastases who within weeks of starting that treatment, those tumours disappeared. And this was utterly, utterly shocking and unheard of. And really revolutionised, obviously, the practice that we now know. And it moved very quickly into what we call a phase 3, a randomised trial where you have to compare standard to new. And that trial compared people, so people were randomised to either receive dacarbazine, the standard at that time, or to the vemurafenib. And this is called a survival curve. At the top where it says 100, that's 100% of the people taking part. And they're followed over time. So the bottom axis is time in months. And you can see that the left-hand curve with dacarbazine, about 50% of those patients, they've all had tumour growth within about 2 months. But you can see that the right-hand curve, the patients on vemurafenib, are tumour-free for much, much longer. And in these situations, there are what we call safety and data monitoring committees who monitor these trials very carefully for ethical signals in terms of safety and efficacy. And they saw this data and they closed the trial early and they said it's not fair, it's not ethical for any patients to be randomized any longer to dacarbazine. And those patients were allowed to switch over to the active arm. And again, immunotherapy, this is the first ipilimumab trial. You're going to hear lots more about this from James Larkin later. And here again, you've got 100% of the patients monitored over time. And unfortunately, with melanoma, most of those patients will die over time. But what you can see, the green curve on the top, you can see it ends up very horizontal. And about 20% of people continue to do well over the longer term. And that, again, was something we'd never seen before with this disease. Usually, everybody has a short life expectancy. And so this has been moved on very quickly into another trial. This is actually comparing the green curve is still ipilimumab. Now you can see the blue curve is nivolumab, the anti-PD-1 antibody. You can see that that curve has been shifted up. And then the orange curve is actually the combination, a tiny, tiny benefit, but it may be worth it for some patients. So this is building from one trial to another trial, changing practice over time. And as you know, these drugs are now standard of care because these people have entered trials. So basically, when we started 2010, life expectancy for most people with metastatic melanoma was well under a year. And with all the work that we've done jointly with the professionals and the patients, we've moved life expectancy on average to 3 years, but about 30% of people have long-term survival benefits. And that's what we're building on still incrementally with more clinical trials that are now ongoing. So in the UK, generally, in 2000, about 400 patients entered clinical trials, and that was about the rate in the United States, and it's still the rate in the United States. In the UK, we now enter about 20 patients per 100 into a clinical trial. And that's thanks to an amazing infrastructure that we have. Starting on the left here regarding how we build new trials, we write those studies, we launch them, and then onto the right, a whole infrastructure that helps us to deliver those trials in the NHS framework and enable those trials to impact NICE and standard of care. In context of skin cancer, we have a multidisciplinary group which I chair, the NCRI, stands for National Cancer Research Institute Clinical Studies Group. We're a multidisciplinary group of oncologists, dermatologists, surgeons, pathologists, GP, patient representation, and we're in the business of looking at all sorts of different trials. We work with commercial partners, we work with drugs and non-interventional studies, radiotherapy, surgery, any kind of thing that's important to patients. And our patients, again, are important in informing the trials that we develop. How can you get involved? Well, clearly we would want our patients to talk with their specialists about trials that are available locally, but we're very keen that patients are proactive in finding trials and pushing us to get you into research. And there's something called the Clinical Trials Gateway, which if you click on that link that I just showed you, it looks a bit like this. So I plugged into here the word melanoma on the left, and Cambridge is where I am. and you can see that it brought up 93 trials. It's not perfect, some of these trials are closed, but it's something which is in development, and I think is quite nice. It's looking good for patients. I think it feels like something that we can work on and develop and make it work for patients. We also have what's called the NCRI portfolio maps that look a bit different. They look a bit like this. Again, they're accessible to patients. And these are sort of separated into separate sections. So for melanoma, you've got metastatic disease, adjuvant therapy, surgical therapy, and then by BRAF status, cutaneous, mucosal, uveal. And if you click on any of these little orange boxes, then it brings up more information about where those trials are being conducted. And lastly, really to say that patient representatives are on all these groups, both research and non-research. So we're very, very keen that patients do engage. And just to show you, this is the NCRI structure, so multiple different groups across all tumour types with lots of other cross-cutting groups in primary care, psychosocial, survivorship, all sorts of aspects, all of which need patient representatives on it to keep us in line, really, and to get us doing the things that are important to you. So I'd like to just thank you for the opportunity to open this conference. You do make a difference in all sorts of aspects, and I do hope you enjoy the day, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I'm very happy to take a couple of questions if anybody's got anything they'd like to ask. Keep me on the straight and narrow.
I know, first person, and then I know, and they're all nervous. Look, we do have a question. There we go.
Yes.
Rollo, is there a microphone around?
I've got a loud voice.
You've got a loud voice.
Okay.
Do you think there is a future with blind randomised trials going forward that way? Or the example you gave, where you just look over. As a patient, that's one of the areas where I'm uncomfortable and I'm quite to the left.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So I think this is a very real issue, and there are very real ethical issues associated with clinical trials. And I know certainly, there was a time, particularly in cardiology, where they were doing placebo-controlled, double-blind, randomized trials when there was an active treatment that was not being given. And I think in cancer, we have worked very hard to ensure a very strong ethical framework with our trials. And as you're rightly saying, patients are now very well aware of their options, and they vote with their feet. And they won't go into a trial if they think that they are, there's a better option. And certainly in the US, one of the reasons why our clinical trial program is so good is that I think patients, particularly in the US, are not interested in the concept of randomization. We are, because we know that really that is the best way to provide evidence-based medicine, because we do know that we've done randomized trials where what looks like an exciting new treatment, like a new vaccine that we put into an adjuvant trial recently, that was actually less effective than the observation arm. It wasn't randomized, it wasn't a blinded trial, but the vaccine arm did worse than no treatment at all. So you can't always assume that the new is going to be better. So there are clever ways of designing trials. For example, there are ways of saying, well, actually, we're going to do the initial phase of placebo-controlled, but actually we will have a crossover design so that if the cancer does come back, you can have that trial you can be unblinded, and if you had the placebo drug, then you can be crossed over to the active drug. So it's actually pushing us, rightly, to be more creative in the way that we design those trials in order that we generate the evidence base, but we first do no harm.
I was just wondering, what do you think has been the main reason for the number of patients being on a clinical trial going from 4% to 20%? Because in Ireland, currently only 3% of patients will go on a clinical trial.
So the massive change that happened in 2001 was a large amount of funding that was put into developing the infrastructure in a service environment to fund research nurses and data managers who took the pressure off the clinicians, who could work with the patients and make it all happen. And that was what the National Cancer Research Network was all about. And that was a multi-group funding stream. That was Department of Health, CRUK, a lot of pharma, lots of other partners who decided actually this was a really important thing to do. And we're very fortunate that we have that kind of infrastructure. Many countries don't, and the US certainly doesn't, and that made the difference.
Thank you. Can I ask a question? You made a comment about the requirement to fund drugs within 3 months if NICE have made a positive approval. I believe that currently is out to consultation at the moment because of the recent newer drugs that have come around hepatitis C and also the HIV prevention drug, which NHS England obviously challenged from a budgetary perspective, even though it was deemed as being clinically effective. That this consultation is trying to decouple that decision process in terms of the clinical. So I suppose what are in terms of the clinical world challenging that in terms of access?
Absolutely. I mean, to me, it makes absolutely no sense. You're simply just, it's a delaying tactic. So I think there are a number of things that you can do. You can have a local discussion to say, actually, we want this implemented directly, but there is no mandatory requirement for your local commissioners so to do. I think you're absolutely right. There are ongoing discussions between NHS England and NICE about the whole process. And that's why I was quite intrigued to see that the fast tracking was reducing 90 days to 30 days as opposed to 0 days, And I don't really see why that's necessary. So I think we as a group just have to keep pushing there. The important thing, I think, is actually making sure that the appraisal process is not, it doesn't start when the licensing happens. So, that whole process, the scoping, used to just start when the licensing. Now we have to do all that scoping when we think that the randomized trial is going to be positive, so that actually you hit the ground running and everything should be in place the minute the licensing comes through. So I think people are very aware of that. I think things are improving. They're not necessarily improving as fast as they should, but I think, as you say, the pressures that we're getting from non-cancer is helping. So I hope that we will see continual improvements there. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much.